People's Tribunal, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, live streaming on Violence Against Women Awareness Day, the 25th of November 2021. Today is the first of 10 days of Violence Against Women awareness. It concludes on the 10th of December, which is International Human Rights Day, and it relates to the fact that so many women are denied their human rights by reason of criminal assault at home and other forms of domestic violence and violence against women on the streets, at work, and in so many places, that women have a right to be and to exist and do more than exist without having violence inflicted against them. I'm here today with several very important and valuable guests. We have with us Dr. Elgin Safarov, Vice Chair of the CEDAW Committee. Welcome, Dr. Safarov. We also have Amelia Womack, Deputy Leader of the Green Party. Welcome, Amelia Womack. And Sian Norris, who is Chief European and Social Affairs Reporter at Byline Times. I'm Dr. Jocelyn A. Scott, and I have had the great good fortune to sit as the President of the CEDAW People's Tribunal and to write the President's report, the purpose of which is to demand that the United Kingdom honour its obligations under CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. The United Kingdom signed this United Nations treaty in 1981 and ratified it in 1986, and is also a signatory to the optional protocol. Now, in this, the United Kingdom has accepted its obligation to bring the terms of CEDAW with its update through the committee, of which Dr. Elgin Safarov is Vice Chair. The United Kingdom has undertaken to put CEDAW with its updates into domestic law. And that is why we're here today for these three panel participants to ensure that you out there have the arguments and the basis for ensuring that the campaign to have the United Kingdom introduce a Women's Bill of Rights can come to fruition. Now, I have the pleasure to hand over to Dr. Elgin Safarov, as I've said, the Vice Chair of the CEDAW Committee, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, for Dr. Safarov to make his opening statement. Thank you, Dr. Safarov.
Thank you very much, dear Jocelyn Scott. It's nice to see you here, and several members participating in this stream, especially. And today's item, very interesting item, especially we have the International Day on the fighting against discrimination and all kinds of violence against women and domestic violence cases, especially internationally recognized days and international by the international, not only by United Nations. And especially I want to underline the role of the United Kingdom in the creation of the CEDAW Convention in 80s and beginning from the 75 support of the United Kingdom, but it was in 70s, 80s and 90s active participation of United Kingdom in women's rights in the community worldwide, especially protection of rights. But what's happening now, but what we have at this moment, for example, situation on the social protection, access, equal access to the services in United Kingdom, in England, for example, differences in the services between the Wales, for example, Scotland and England, different access and at the same time social and health access, especially women and men comparable situation. We have different situations and we have COPs which are including directly last reporting procedure of United Kingdom to the CEDAW Committee in 2019. And we have, including underlining that older woman discrimination cases, state taking the obligatory to prevent such kind of discrimination. But unfortunately, we cannot go on, and we do not see the steps which done for the resolving such kind of problems, especially when we're underlining pay gap questions which coming from the 18th, 19th, and the 2000s, which pension rights we have differences because pay gap was 2 years, 20 years, 30 years, several decades. That's why when we're comparing the pension rights, the social services, health services, legal services access different communities in the local places and the difference in the cities and villages, we see the problematic items. And it's a beginning from the village elimination, comparative situation. But when compares the situation with the United Kingdom, I want to underline the several actual problems, especially in this line. Here we see and can compare the real situation, for example, the in decision-making participation of women, and what's the differences, what's the policy, because it's different representation, and in several points we have the downing, the allowing the situations, and it was, for example, compared 10 years ago. What's the main reason of the local representation, participation, women, and differences in such kind of, why we have such kind of problems for older people, for older women on the article of 1 and 2, on the definition rights of the discrimination especially, why we have no temporary special measures for the protection of older women in these cases, especially pension rights, why we have not such kind of points on the articles of 10, education and the labor rights of the older women especially, and protection, especially programs. Of course, government doing and trying to do several points, but in COVID-19 situation, unfortunately, we see that problems are going deeper. And it's not only in Great Britain, it's especially at all countries of Council of Europe and worldwide, we see it deepest. But what the state departments doing for the resolving it, or the state decision resolving such kind of problem is different understanding. You can compare situation, what's doing during the COVID-19 and two COVID-19 situations. Does it taking cover in the operative and doing the measures for the all several categories of people, population, women. For example, we see asylum-seeking women, minorities, national minorities rights, for example, discrimination on these cases. We have not only the point of the older woman as a category, but older woman problematic rights at all articles of CEDAW Convention, beginning from the full definition, discrimination, and finishing with the family relations at the same point. What about this, and why state organizations, state departments do not do it as operative as it needs to be done? Because United Kingdom, as in other European countries, as a fundamental human rights state, which are creating these standards, international standards, but why it's going down by this standards problem, we see the problems of the implementation. And my main point that we have the good legislation, we have the good comparative situation, but problem of implementation is difficult, especially you see the problem of implementation in COVID-19, which are going deeper, especially domestic violence cases, FGM cases, killings of the women's cases, which are not giving to the media information, clear answers to the community, United Kingdom. It's different regional implementations, and we have not the feedback. Real feedback, understanding of the situation, and it's very important to get full information to the community to understand why domestic violence cases finish it with the killings when it was called already several times to earlier, because this domestic violence cases repeatedly several times. And it's finished with the killings. The main problem when you have the information registration, and after the registration, you did not do anything. That's the main problem, that you have the hotline, you have the services, but those services working at this situation, especially difficult situation when you have the repeatedly domestic violence cases. What about minorities, people who are victims of trafficking, minority women especially, national minority women who are victims of the trafficking? We are opening Pandora when we beginning the question of the women rights and different understanding of the organizations. I do not want to go deeper, but we have the NGOs, we have state organizations, we have media organizations, and different understanding of women rights and gender equality policy. It's a main point because giving a report to the international organizations, to Council of Europe, to United Nations is different point, but to working with your own population, especially giving the equality rights in this point, it's different question. But if you cannot cover this point, and if you cannot do it the same services which are on paper, it's different problem. It's problem of implementation and problem of the killings, problem of the repeatedly domestic violence cases, problem of different access to the social services. And it's a very important case when you have the inquiries and communications questions against Great Britain, citizens of the Great Britain. We have the cases which are including several states, Germany and United Kingdom, for example, France and United Kingdom in communication inquiries, where you have underlined the point of the different parents when you have and children which are the victims of domestic violence, but at the same time they have not access, especially girls, to the services because it's going to the legal points. It's not operately resolving these problems. When during the time when court will be giving the decision, it took it more time. But some cases we need to do it very operative regulations. Act in this point. That's why when we're going to the rights of the equal rights in labor sphere, in the equality of education, especially for older people, older women, we do not see the same approach and the same campaigns. What kind of programs it's interesting, including during the COVID-19 situation for the older women? Do you have this information? Did it effectively including what about the reporting and a survey about the effectiveness of this program and real results? Does it doing for only do it, at the state programs, or you have the effective information or data on this point? Unfortunately, we do not have such kind of data because it's closed and it's not transparent or open to us, especially statistic data when you cannot compare situation between COVID-19 and 18 years till COVID-19 situation. You have only the situation about the cases of domestic violence. You have the cases information the higher about the killings, but it's just the first point. But what about the sex discrimination questions? What about the problems of the access to the service on the regional levels, for example? And why we have the different policies between England, Scotland, and Wales? Why we have the different access to all services? I'm not going to the point by point because if we were going back to the social service, I will open many points, legitimization questions, social pensions, social supports, many points will be including decision-making positions, and at the same time, a very big problem which are not resolved till this time. Excuse me, it's reality for the women with disabilities and girls with disabilities in COVID-19 situation. You can underline it with a red line, which is a difficult situation because in United Kingdom we have a big, representation of women as a disabled, but they not representing in the decision-making situation, especially on the regional levels. That's why when we're going and trying to compare situation about the women's rights, on this point, we need to go through the communications and inquiries questions, beginning from the citizens of the United Kingdom. And we have the underlying main problem in this situation. When you do not get answer, and these citizens going to the international organizations, as CEDAW Convention, as the European Court for Human Rights, as to the Council of Europe, and in other organizations, they're trying to find the citizens of UK justification and trying to protect their rights in front of the international organizations. But we have already this legislation. We have already documents on paper in the United Kingdom. And what about implementation? I have this question for the United Kingdom government, and I think we need to give it to get more answers. And what about the sex delimited statistic data? It's not fully covered. When you have not direct service, when you have not this information, you cannot compare the real situation. That's why today we are only taking point by point situation, comparing what we have on our hands. But you have the problems which are open for you. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Safarov. And every point that you've raised, of course, resonates, because during the hearings from the 21st, 22nd, 23rd of June, when the CEDAW tribunal sat, these issues were raised that you emphasise. The data collection and the lack of disaggregated data is serious in this union. The differences between Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales are significant too. And it's significant that Scotland and Wales are moving towards a Bill of Rights for women. And yet the Parliament at Westminster, we are urging to do so, to actually get on its bike with regard to this. And the points about Black and minoritised women who are deprived of equal services. And what we need to remember is that it's not a comparison of the services to Black and minoritised women versus the services to non-Black and minoritised women. What we should be comparing is the services for Black and minoritised women and the mainstream services that are mainly serving the men of the community, because it's this differential that's the actual crucial one, whilst recognising that non-Black and minoritised women are advantaged over their Black and minoritised sisters. And also, I need just to note at this point, and then if I may come to Amelia Womack, because one of the issues that's also crucial is, of course, climate change, the environmental emergency, the biodiversity emergency, the climate change emergency. But I first must mention, one, the issue of pensions that Dr. Safarov raised, that pensions are not some sort of gratuity from the state. Pensions are a right. They are a worker's right. And the women who were born in the 1950s, who are now being deprived quite wrongly by the United Kingdom of their entitlement that is as of right, should be recognised with the rights that they have. And rather than the United Kingdom government simply hiding itself, if I may put it colloquially, under a very large rock, it must come out from under that rock and acknowledge the workers' rights, the worker entitlements, the actual human rights of those women who are entitled to the pension as of right. And also I wanted to mention that the government is at least now going to issue a command paper, and it should be out today, on International Labour Organization, ILO, Convention 190 on sexual harassment and bullying in the workplace. Now, of course, with a Women's Bill of Rights, we'd be addressing sexual harassment and bullying not only in the workplace, but in terms of accommodation, in terms of education, in terms of provision of services and generally. But at least we must pay tribute to the fact that the United Kingdom government is now at least paying attention by command paper to the International Labour Organization Convention 190. And having said all that, with very great thanks to Elgin, to Dr. Safarov, I'll now turn to Amanda Womack from the Greens Party. Over to you, Amelia, sorry.
Thank you so much. And so much of that, Dr. Saffron, really did resonate. And I would really like to build on a number of those points as someone who has worked as a campaigner to make misogyny a hate crime. So a lot of that, of how we register statistics and how we ensure that we're monitoring hate crime in our communities directed at people simply because of their gender, is actually A, recorded, police are B, trained to address and acknowledge this issue in our society, which has become even more profound after Sarah Everard's murder. And also, it means that we're able to reevaluate a lot of actions and stop normalizing actions in the workplace, in the street. Young people that I've spoken to as young as 12 experiencing street harassment because it's deemed acceptable in our society by groups of men who are not stopping each other, to effectively harassing children in this way is completely unacceptable. And so the Make Misogyny a Hate Crime campaign is a real way to completely reevaluate how we see ourselves as a society. And I think that as a survivor of domestic violence myself, if we are reporting the lower level of this abuse, then it means that there is further evidence when that does turn into violence directed at women at different stages, and gives women support when they're so often ignored and not believed when they come forward with their violence and abuse, other forms of abuse cases. But women are so badly represented. We saw the Prime Minister, while talking about misogyny as a hate crime, say police should be out there solving the real crimes, as if crimes against 51% of the population wasn't real enough. And this is what really frustrates me on this issue, on all issues around women's rights, is I feel like we're treated like we're a fringe group. We're not treated like people who make up the majority of our country, of our society. We're not treated as people who are often at the forefront of the biggest issues of our time. And with the climate emergency, Brexit and COVID, we see a whole different picture being painted on women's rights and the way that our government and governments around the world often dismiss women. I think I need to begin with, I think that when we're talking about this, it's really important. When you read about abuse, it's not good enough to say, to just kind of talk about abuse as an equal. We really need to be pushing up women's rights to ensure that we are addressing the imbalances. So if you know two people who are in an abusive relationship, then you shouldn't just say both people have equal parts, equal say in this. We should be looking at this as an abuse in our society. So let's look at the climate. Well, let's start by looking at COVID, and I'll then move on to the climate emergency, because this is important. And the growing issues that we're seeing around the world, we cannot turn a blind eye to. When COVID hit, our government implies that we couldn't foresee what was going to happen. And to me, that is a deception, because we could see what was going to happen. We had a couple of months advantage on China, 3 weeks advantage on Italy. And what we saw in all of those countries that had already been hit by COVID was that domestic violence increased. I worked with women in different political parties to ensure that ahead of the lockdown, we were trying to put in place support for women, but a blind eye was turned. We look at Brexit. I feel, again, when I was talking about women's rights and how our rights are protected in Europe, and I feel like they'd be undermined if we left, that, again, I was told that this was a marginal issue, not something that should be the core to our analysis and understanding of how our country works and operates. And now it comes to the climate emergency, which I feel like lots of people talk about as if it's on the horizon. Whereas I've spoken to women who live on the Philippines, and as a result of a super hurricane that went through there, tens of thousands of people were killed. And for her to feed herself and support her family, she was having to get food out of the ocean from around her island, which was the same location, the same place as dead bodies were floating as a result of the deaths that had taken place from that climate-related disaster. And it's women who are on the forefront of the climate emergency. It is women who are often there with the strongest connection to our environment, whether they're involved in agriculture, whether they're even involved in wood collection, whether they're working, the Indigenous women from all kinds of different countries who are there providing the nature-based solutions we need in their day-to-day lives, not because it's new, but because it's about their long-term connection to the earth and environment. When we were talking at COP26, we could see that women were underrepresented. I was a Blue Zone delegate, and I would just like to add, so the Blue Zone is just civil society observers, but in terms of the actual delegation and the people negotiating, In COP1 in 1995, we saw 88% men, 12% women. In COP21 in 2015, 69% men, 31% women. COP25 2019, 62% men, 38% women. So I don't have the stats for this year, but we can imagine that that's gone higher. However, 74% of the plenary and the conversations and the negotiations were dominated by men. Despite the fact that countries have acknowledged that women's voices are key to this, that women are the people who have not made the decisions that have created the climate emergency, but they will be the ones who are impacted first and impacted worst. And it's this gap in the decision-making table that really shows that, well, it embeds the political inaction that we're seeing around addressing this from a gender perspective and ensuring women's rights are at the core of our gender analysis when it comes to how we put in place a Green New Deal that means we're addressing inequality in our society while remaining below 1.5 degrees of warming, but also means that we are missing out on those stories and experiences that women have on the coalface of these issues. We know that when we were talking about loss and damage, we've seen from evidence from Oxfam and other organisations that giving money to women directly employs a community. And when it comes to climate change, means that those solutions are embedded within the community and will has a much wider impact. And that's increased again when money and support is given directly to Indigenous women. And the intersections of all these aspects, as has been touched on, are so relevant when it comes to climate. And it is women of colour, it's working class women, it's disabled women who are going to be harmed. And I would just like to note that this year was the first COP where there was a group to listen to the voice of disabled people. And it was the first time that it was recognised that disabled people would be harmed by the climate emergency, which is, I feel like it's many small steps, but as we said in the opening, we were starting to talk about violence against, we were talking about these issues back in the 80s, and yet we haven't seen the seismic shift that we need to address these inequalities. We know that at times of disaster, that it is women that are harmed, whether that's hurricanes in America, where in the areas that people were taken for refuge, women were being raped in those safe places. And we know that it's women who will often not feed themselves because they are feeding their families in time of disaster. And we know that with the trajectory we're on, that the climate disaster is not only here, but it's going to get worse. And that impact will have impact, that impact on women has not been analysed, understood, or worked to be addressed. So whether it's COVID, whether it's Brexit, whether it's the climate emergency, this gender lens has been failing us because we are classed as a fringe, as a margin, as a pressure group, rather than actually addressing women as 51% of the population and ensuring that our rights and our right to exist and be supported is actually at the heart of our policy and government.
Thanks so much, Amelia. And again, you too have raised so many very important issues, building and drawing strength from Dr. Safarov's presentation, but also bringing in your own, of course, perspective. And when you were talking about the lack of women at COP26 and before, what came to mind immediately was Security Council Resolution 1325, because Security Council Resolution 1325, of course, addresses conflict. But the point is that we are in a conflict situation with climate change, with the climate emergency, the biodiversity emergency, and so on. We shouldn't need resolutions such as that to ensure that women are incorporated effectively into negotiations and discussions and decision making. But every item that's there, just as a Women's Bill of Rights would be on the table saying these rights must be affirmed and recognised. And as Dr. Safarov was making the point, you can have laws, but you have to make sure they're going to be, that they will be implemented. And I just did want to comment further on this climate change, and then of course come to Sian Norris, that I was listening to a seminar, a webinar on the climate change, and one of the participants was making a point that they had visited the Marshall Islands, and in the Marshall Islands, one of the Pacific islands, of course, that are at risk of going under, and their islands are already doing so, Fiji, Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands, and so on. The children on the Marshall Islands knew the realities of climate change, and they could all discuss what the issues were in climate change and the environmental emergency. And one particular child's family had been thinking about moving to the United States for a better possibilities in terms of education, but they'd been rethinking it because they thought, why should we move from the Marshall Islands where our children are getting real information, real education about climate change, which is an emergency and has to be on in the education system in every country. Why should we move to the United States where they might start getting contradictory information and misinformation and false information? Now, just also to refer to the misogyny as a hate crime issue and the importance of training, is that kept coming up time and again in the hearings before the CEDAW People's Tribunal. And your point about ensuring that so-called lower level violence against women needs to be recorded and reported is absolutely crucial. One of the points I think to which attention needs to be paid is this whole issue of non-molestation orders, whatever they want to call it. In each country, there's this. It's that if a woman goes to the police and complains about criminal assault at home and other forms of domestic violence, then the chances are she might get an order to have the man who's engaging in this conduct away from the house and not allowed to come within a certain distance, etc. Now, ironically, 2 points here. If the man breaches that order, and I hear from police in London that their resources are so down, they actually really can't police those orders anyway, that was reported to me. But if the man breaches the order, he's not going to be brought to book for the crime that he's committed, but it is for the breach of the order, which is an insult to the state effectively, because breaching an order is about the order. What has happened is the woman has been criminally assaulted or worse. And the second point to make here is that a woman's not going to get an order the first time she's hit, the first time she's raped, the first time she's bashed, beaten and brutalised. There will have been a history, a long history, before she gets to the police, before the police take it seriously, before a court will take it seriously. And therefore, in my opinion, we need to be revisiting that whole issue of the non-molestation order and its absolute ineffectiveness. How often have you heard about a woman being killed, a woman being murdered, and she has an order? It has not stopped her from losing her life. So thank you so much, Amanda Womack, for all those important issues. And now I would like to...
Can I just quickly add to that? I really apologies for interrupting, but also
no, please.
I think it's also important that we talk about the women who take their own lives because they see no way out. And I believe it's 30 women a week who try and take their own lives as a result of abuse. And I feel like their experiences should also be acknowledged and their deaths also acknowledged in terms of abuse.
Absolutely crucial. And what you say raises yet another issue, because we live in a world where there's more attention paid to actual suicide than to attempted suicide. Now, of course, we don't want anybody to commit suicide, and we agree and recognise that for someone to commit suicide, there must have been a terrible, stressful situation and the circumstances under which they were living. But we should not be discounting attempted suicide, but it's discounted because it's mainly women. And one of the reasons it's mainly women is not because they're just trying to make someone dance in a drama. It's very real, the tragic situations in which they are. But I know that there are many women now suffering from brain damage because more and more women are using the method of hanging. And because they actually don't manage to kill themselves, that's an attempted suicide, having hanged themselves and still remaining alive, they actually suffer brain damage. And so you've got women with brain damage who are living and still alive because of the issues that you're raising, Amelia, the damage that they're suffering quite often on the home front, but also the general stresses that women suffer because of violence and other discriminatory factors. So thank you for, and please everybody intervene. And it's not an interruption, it's a positive intervention. But I'd just like to pass over to Sian Norris, to our Sian, to make her contribution, and then we'll go to a general panel discussion about these very important issues and the Women's Bill of Rights. Thanks, Sian.
Hi there. I'm just trying to move a bit out of the sun. It's so lovely having the sun in my flat, but I feel like I'm kind of very bright on the screen. So apologies if I keep shuffling around. Thank you so much for having me today. It's really an honor to be on a panel with such amazing speakers, particularly on International Day of Ending Violence Against Women and Girls. I think we can all agree it's not been a good year. I mean, we've had tragedy after tragedy after tragedy this year. And I think, as I understand it, since the 25th of November 2020, we've seen 120 women lose their lives as a result of male violence, or a man is the primary suspect or the convicted killer of that woman. That's 120 women who have left family behind, who have left loved ones behind, who have left people who are grieving a friend, a mother, a daughter, an auntie, a colleague, someone that they loved and cared for. These are lives that have been cut short as a result of male violence. And yet, I can probably name 4 of them that I've seen on the news. We are so silent about the impact and the extent of male violence against women and girls in this country. We know that 120 women have lost their lives, and yet it's so common, it's so pedestrian that we don't even see it in the news headlines anymore. Along with that figure, we know that around 86,000 women will have been raped in England and Wales every single year. We know that about 1.2 million women will experience domestic abuse in England and Wales every year. And yet, despite these numbers, despite these devastating figures, we also know that a woman who is raped has a 1 in 70 chance of seeing her rapist prosecuted and convicted and in jail. This means that rape has been effectively decriminalised in the UK, because women know that there's very little justice available to them. And more importantly, men who choose to rape know that if they do so, they are more likely to get away with it. We seem to be stuck in these endless cycles. Last year, the End Violence Against Women Coalition, working with the Centre for Women's Justice, IMCAN and Rape Crisis England and Wales, put together a dossier to take to the then Justice Secretary Robert Buckland that explained some of the reasons why women had had their cases thrown out by the Crown Prosecution Service or by the police themselves. These included women who had been raped at knife point, women who had had additional violence done to them during the rapes, and just very, very distressing examples of long-term domestic abuse and sexual exploitation. And yet, these cases were seen as not worth going to trial, because the women had exchanged WhatsApp messages where they had expressed a sexual preference. Perhaps in those WhatsApp messages, they'd been flirting with the eventual perpetrator. Another woman was so intoxicated with alcohol that she couldn't quite remember where she'd been driven by her rapist, and therefore was not considered a believable witness of her own rape. These are the kind of situations that we have heard for years and years and years. Back in 2005, I remember the Amnesty survey that found that so many people did not believe that believed a woman was partially responsible for her rape because she was wearing a short skirt. I don't understand how nearly 20 years later, we are still having these same attitudes. The attitude is the same. The technology is what has changed. Now we're looking at WhatsApp messages instead of short skirts. But the idea that a woman is culpable for her own rape because of her own behavior, rather than seeing men as and the perpetrator as wholly responsible is something we continue to struggle to shift. Of course, one of the most famous instances we had of fatal male violence this year was the Sarah Everard case. I know that I woke up the morning that we found out that she'd lost, that her body had been found, completely devastated. I wrote one of the fastest, most angriest articles I've ever written as a journalist. Because I felt that we were back again in this same mindset, this same situation. We woke up that morning to when she'd been disappeared for a week and then her body was found, to being told that we should not be walking around the streets on our own at night. Even though this was the lockdown, the one thing women were allowed to do was walk around outside. We couldn't do anything else. That was our one sort of freedom that we've been granted in the coronavirus lockdown for completely understandable and correct reasons in terms of public health. We were told that if women were the same as car keys, that we wouldn't leave our car keys on a table and not expect our car to be stolen. We were told that women were houses, that we'd been like, if we wouldn't leave our window open and not accept our house to be burgled. But women are not car keys, we're not houses. We are human beings that have a right to the same freedoms and the same liberties as men. And yet over and over again, when something horrific happens, like the Sarah Everard killing, we are given the same messages that it is up to us to stay indoors, to restrict our freedoms, to reduce our own liberties, in order to allow men to continue to have theirs. And then, of course, when we got to September, it was a sentencing, and we discovered that Wayne Couzens, the Sarah Everard killer, had to use his position as a police officer in order to arrest her, or to falsely arrest her, in order to carry out his abduction, the rape and the killing. And again, the response was just devastating. We were told that if we were in that situation, we should just run into a stranger's house or flag down a bus. We were told that we should challenge a police officer, something that I, as a white woman, might be able to do, but Black and minority ethnic women face a massively intersectional barrier in terms of their interactions with the police. There was never a sense that there was something that the police could do to change how women saw them, so that there was something the police could do to encourage women's trust. And the only thing that we've seen coming out of the Metropolitan Police is this promise that an officer would have to verify his identity, which we know Wayne Couzens would have been able to do because he was a serving police officer with a serving police officer's identity. So what is the solution there? What is the promise that has been made to restore women's trust? So those are the terrible things. I could talk about a lot more. We've seen the horrific situation in Afghanistan, where the return of the Taliban to Kabul and the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban has led to a horrific situation for women and girls. Girls denied education, women denied workplaces, a very, very real fear of a return to the kind of street violence and repression that we saw throughout the 90s. We saw in August, again, the incel killing in Plymouth, this movement of men who have a very, very violent attitude towards women, who see women as objects that they can own and that they have a right to exploit. And yet, this is not seen as terrorism. This is not seen as an ideology. This is just seen as something that men are allowed to think of women. But I do believe that there is hope too. I think one of the really encouraging things that I have seen this year is a real movement from women that has come from a place of anger and has come from a place of frustration, but it is manifesting itself in solidarity and sisterhood. When the Sarah Everard murder happened, there was a real movement of women coming together, sharing their stories, expressing their pain, but more than that, demanding better and demanding change. And we seem to have moved beyond, thankfully, those kind of moments when all we can do is share the terrible things that have happened to us and actually come together with a righteous anger and a determination and an ambition for something different and for something better. We've also seen some positive legislative change in things like the domestic abuse bill. Now, I am very, very highly critical of the domestic abuse bill, and I will explain why. But as a piece of legislation, there is something important in marking down that domestic abuse is something Parliament is beginning to take seriously. And there are aspects of the domestic abuse bill that I think will be really positive in recognising gender-based violence and the gendered impact of domestic abuse. However, there are serious problems with this piece of legislation. The fundamental problem is that it does nothing to protect women with insecure migration status. So these are women who have a no recourse to public funds as part of their immigration status in the UK, which means that they can't access public benefits and are therefore in a very, very difficult position should they be experiencing domestic abuse. There was really, really fantastic attempts by Labour MPs to get an amendment in that would open up domestic abuse refuge services and financial support to women with no recourse to public funds, so that migrant women could leave domestic abuse situations. But unfortunately, that amendment was defeated. And this means that even with a piece of landmark legislation that does have a lot of good in it, it has completely failed to protect some of the most vulnerable people in our society. Another really disappointing aspect of the domestic abuse bill was the failure on funding. And this is something that I think the Women's Bill of Rights has a really positive thing that it can do, which is to ensure that there is proper, sustainable and sustained funding for support services for women fleeing domestic abuse and any form of gender-based violence. And finally, I just wanted to say a quick word on reproductive rights, because that's what I specialise in. So this week we had another attempt, a very, very laudable attempt by two MPs, Maria Miller and Diana Johnson, to decriminalise abortion in Great Britain. This remains one of the biggest scandals, in my view, for women's sexual and reproductive health rights in the UK. In Great Britain, abortion remains a criminal offence unless it takes place under the strict exceptions of the 1967 Act, which means in order to access an abortion before 24 weeks, a woman needs a signature of 2 doctors to affirm that continuing the pregnancy will be harmful to her mental or physical health. Now, of course, we know that pregnancy is more likely to be harmful to a woman's mental or physical health because pregnancy and childbirth is in itself quite a dangerous thing to go through. However, the fact that we still insist on women having to gain permission in this way, and that we still see it as a doctor's decision rather than a woman's own decision to access healthcare, is a real problem. And so we do really, really need to support these moves to decriminalise abortion, so that abortion is recognised as a healthcare issue and not a criminal law issue. Because if you choose to have an abortion outside of the exceptions of the Act, you are breaking a very, very old Victorian law, which could see you end up in prison. And so I think, this week was a real reminder of how far we do have to go in terms of gaining full sexual and reproductive health rights in the UK, even though we do have what is technically quite a liberal abortion system, in that women are generally able to access abortion. But the principle remains that abortion is healthcare, it's not criminal law. And so it would be good to see that change happen. But yes, sorry, that was my whistle-stop tour of some of the difficult, challenging and distressing issues that we face this year and every year. But as I say, I do think that there is a real movement with women and girls and feminist allies as well in challenging and fighting back against the violence that we are suffering every single day. There's been a real sense of we're not putting up with this anymore. And my big hope is that we can continue to use that energy and that positive force of anger to create change and to say that this is enough and it's time for something better for women and girls. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sian. And here I must pay tribute to Dr. Safarov and the CEDAW committee on the abortion issue, because it may interest viewers to know that Northern Ireland now is actually ahead of England, because the committee, the CEDAW committee, demanded effectively that the Northern Ireland should acknowledge women's right to full and proper healthcare treatment and undo its attitude towards abortion. What happened was that the United Kingdom Parliament actually took action, and now abortion is legal in Northern Ireland. But ironically, what happened at that time was that the United Kingdom Parliament abolished the provisions in the Offences Against the Person Act of 1861, which make abortion a crime. So abortion is no longer a crime in Northern Ireland, but ironically, it remains a crime in England, because the Abortion Act of 1967 now contains a provision, Section 5, which makes any abortion or termination of pregnancy that takes place other than in accordance with exactly what you pointed out, Sian, it will be criminal. So this is the irony. Now, in Northern Ireland, we know from the evidence before the tribunal that there's still a problem of access. but at least it's not criminal, whereas in this country it remains so. And the other point that so many women don't realise is, again, as you pointed out, if you have an abortion in this country or in Wales, in England or in Wales, the chief medical officer is obliged to receive a report from the doctor who has carried out that abortion. It's 2 pages long at least, the information that has to be sent about your abortion, who you are, what your postcode is, and so on. Women, I don't think, realise this, and I agree with you absolutely, Sian. Action must be taken. And this country, England and Wales, need to get rid of the criminalisation. It's been done elsewhere. I'll be a bit chauvinist. All the states in Australia now have utterly decriminalised abortion, as they should. It's a medical operation and it should be treated as a health matter. But just if I can quickly comment, and then we'll come to the panel and we'll look at these very important issues of implementation and introduction of a Women's Bill of Rights. But your statistics on the issue of rape and the murder of women were absolutely stunning, Sian. And when I was looking at the Crown Prosecution Service statistics in terms of those crimes that they mostly don't continue a prosecution with, it's flashing, it's domestic violence or criminal assault at home and other forms of domestic violence, and rape. And so they're all crimes where women are the primary victims and hopefully survivors. So it's the police that we must be focusing on, but we must focus on the Crown Prosecution Service as well, and they need training, just as was referred to by Amelia. And the final point I'd really like to make, and then hand over, of course, this wonderful panel who must come in, grooming. You see, we need to think about language, and we should stop using this word grooming, because when somebody, for example, comes onto the internet and engages with a young person and is creating circumstances where they want to meet with that young person in order to carry out sexually abusive acts, that conduct is called grooming. No, it's not. It's actual abuse. It is abuse, and we need to recognise it, that it's not a precursor to abuse, which is what grooming implies. It is abuse in and of itself. And similarly, if an adult in actual person is communicating with a young person, not on the internet this time, but in person, and they're leading that young person to believe that they, the adult, have a real concern and a sincere interest in them as the young person, as a human being, that as a precursor to a sexual act, that would be classified as grooming. It's not. It's abuse and exploitation in itself, because if an adult leads a child to believe that that adult has a real concern about them and is seriously interested in them as a human being, it is abusive. It's exploited in and of itself. So back to my issue about language, we really need to think about the language we're using and what we're saying. And the Domestic Abuse Bill, of course, or the Domestic Abuse Act as it is, terminology is absolutely appalling and it needs to be readdressed. But now, let's come to some of the issues that I would really love to have you address. Could we come to this issue that Dr. Safarov raised at the beginning about the rights of older women? Because given that every article in CEDAW can be used to assist older women, why is there a call for more to be done? Does this mean there's a lack of understanding in CEDAW, or does it mean that really there is something that needs to go beyond CEDAW, so that when we have it drafted as the Women's Bill of Rights that we need to pay particular attention to how the terminology and the provisions are expressed to ensure that older women's rights are acknowledged and recognised? Dr. Safarov, over to you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank, first of all, Amelie Womack and Sian Norris for your interventions, for your information, especially underlining important points. But first of all, going to the older woman, I want to underline several points what done already, especially you say about the reproductive rights. I fully agree with the abortion rights. It's a woman's rights on her body, what to do. And it must be decriminalized at all levels, at all countries, of course. Abortion rights, it's a woman's rights, especially. She has full right for to do about her body. Unfortunately, several states on the ground of the religion dependence, sometimes giving different decisions. But we are living in 21st century. We are creating a world community. We are saying about the space technology. But what about the human rights? Does it human rights staying in 20th century? It needs to be going on, and we need to work especially this point, especially reproductive health, and especially when you are going some problems about the obstetric violence, which are very important in Great Britain, especially, and you have different approach in healthcare sectors, especially different understanding. And is it working, for example, for such kind of questions, obstetric violence in UK, in England, for example, and in other, for example, Wales, North Ireland? I fully agree with Jocelyn Scott about the information Northern Ireland, because it was at the time of the reporting procedure, it was very important to underline this abortion rights and to include in the legislation, make just the changes. Because we get the reports from the NGOs, we get the information from the state, and need to be changed at this moment because it was difficult in a situation. And the same point at going on, yeah, you can change the same time the legislation, but what about fighting with the stereotypes of the civil servants, for example, who are giving this service to you, not only in the health sector, but in the police department at the same time, in another structures which are going and working with you, does it, they have right to get your private interest, private information about you, especially about as a citizen? I think this information must be closed, especially about the abortion rights. And I want to underline one more point about the sexual abuses and how multiple violation about the women in detention and drug users. We have such kind of weak sides of the population which are already violated because they have the dependence about alcohol, drug using. They sometimes you see the double violation of the rights. They are victims at the same time of domestic violence. They are victims of the in detention at the same time, and they sometimes do not know what to do, where to go, whom to call, how to say. And hotlines do not taking care, do not registering sometimes such kind of cases because they cannot give the clear information, because they have all the psychological trauma. And sometimes you need to be heard about the psychological care, about the situation, and stigmatization of such kind of community people, women, especially in the community, that they beginning alone, they have not any access from their family members, from their friends, they have stigmatized. And now we are going to the older woman, and we are underlining into CEDAW committees. And very important that NGOs working on this line, what doing NGOs, how they opening questions in front of the international organizations, what they underline in this point, what kind of about alternative reports of the human rights defenders, and at the same time ombudspersons at the same time in this point. And alternative reports underline the real situation in Great Britain, England, UK, US, and Northern Ireland about the situation. Because as I underlined in my first point in the opening side, that when we say about the older woman, we can beginning from the first article of the CEDAW committee and can finish from the 6th. All articles and all discrimination sites, including for the older woman at this moment, not only in UK, but in all world, in all Europe also same. But what states doing for the prevention of these violences? Prevention is this discrimination on the ground of the sex. Prevention gender-based violence, fighting with the unemployment question of the older women and older men. And what about when we include pay gap questions, which are going directly lack to our pensions rights? You see the pay gap questions, which including a percentage difference, which including is the pensions. They take directly a percentage from the pays, salary, and including in this point as using the government sites for the payment. And it is very difficult question when you have, especially, and the people who are already including. I want to underline the point about what done by Amelia Bumak about the hate speech programs and Me Too programs. Very important and need to be underlined and need to be done, especially when we say about online bullying questions about we have this on bullying questions not only against girls, in online virtual life, but at the same time we have the hate speech programs, hate speech violation, especially older women in the internet community. We have such kind of problematic items. Sometimes elder women have not access to internet or have the very big access and cannot using social networks and giving their words, giving their problems. It's important point because we cannot saying the guilty. The question of the poverty, the question of the support, social support of this community level people who are have not access to the, and mainly the migrants. Members of the older women from the migrants, national minorities, they have the problems of the using and they do not inform about the procedure of the application. That's the question of the problematic items caused on the place because they not use it, especially in COVID-19 situation when you have the limitations. And now you see that many European countries adopted new restrictions, new mandatory limitations on the freedoms of human rights freedoms. And I think the important questions that human rights defenders and NGO members will cover and will underline, especially older women representation in labor sector, and at the same time including and supporting their rights. On the article of 10, it's education. Article of 11, it's CEDAW Convention on Labor Rights. We gave the special recommendations to the Great Britain. You can compare recommendations from 2008-9 COPs with 2019. It's different, and you will see. But when we compare 2019 situation and now, I think we see the deepest of the problems and underlying aggravating situation in this point, especially domestic violence cases about the older women living with the people who are living with them, with the children, with men. It's different approach, different situations are the same, because during the pandemic situation, situation when everything was closed and the flats was closed, especially, you cannot giving your voice. Sometimes you cannot go on, and you have not the freedoms what you have, especially which including in our UN declarations on human rights. It must be continuing work, and how we are including it. But the main point is the protection of human rights, especially older women, and underlines the prevention of the violence, the prevention of discrimination at all sides. But how we will do it, it's a difficult question, because it's different understanding between the government sector, NGO sector, and private sector. You cannot take the common point where they have the access and the consent, for example, on the understanding. When you're speaking with the private sector members, they're saying that we have legislation, we have the contract law, but what about we have the right, taking out from the board because pension rights. But the main point that older women as older men have not representation in high level ranking of the private sector. The main difference in this point, because the heads of the companies, most of the in the world, as in Great Britain, at the same time are men, not women. That's why when women are losing their positions, they are losing everything at that moment. They are going to the pension rights. We are already discriminated, But when we going with the men situations, they are heads of the companies, heads of the private sector, heads of the media sectors, heads of they are civil servants, there's heads of the diplomatic missions. You can compare situation in Great Britain, how many women heads of the diplomatic missions, does it comparable, for example, 30 years ago and now? What's the real situation? And does they have access, for example, when they write access of the pension right, how they can continue their representation in labor sector, why it's closed position and they forcibly going to the, as a pension, why they cannot continue in other sphere of the community working at this moment, because the programs are not effective, because you are not using these additional programs for the supporting such kind of community people, which are giving for the development of the state, of this state, especially Great Britain, United Kingdom, especially giving and involved in this point many years, 40, 50 years. But at this moment, because it's a pay gap question, when it was 40 years and you cannot resolve this time, you have the problem of the pension, you have the problem of access to the all points. Unfortunately, it's reality for the Great Britain at this moment. Unfortunately, it's discriminated. Unfortunately, we have including this point and the segregation question is also the same, because it's a sex discrimination, sex segregation. And we have vertical segregation at this moment, and we can compare vertical segregation points and legislation and implementation policy. And if you have such kind of country, you have the segregation because of the different also approach and legislations. It's Northern Ireland and Wales, Scotland at the same time, and England at the same time. And it's different understanding and different stereotypes in the families, different standards in the community. The main problem when you have this different standards, you cannot completely implement it. Why we are not including the common standards, fundamental standards on the abortion rights? It's a big question. It's fundamental, including principles for the whole community of the world. Why it's not included in these times? Why we have not criminalization of the obstetric violence, excuse me. It needs to be including and implementing directly, because thousands and thousands of women are victims of such kind of violences. Why we have not including real legislation points on the rape, sex violences, and especially I want to underline point about the economic domestic violence kinds, and at the same time psychological domestic violence cases. Why we have the problem of legislation of these two very important points, and we have not including the main points and administrative cases for this point. What about the registration, and what about the responsibility? How many of these cases was including in the court realization, in the precedent law? That's why it's very difficult understanding, and I think that I hope that it will be resolved for the for the United Kingdom community population, but it needs to be time, to go from one step to another, because it's very difficult to work with different legislation standards in such kind of country, because the community stereotypes and the civil servants also same, representatives of the service people are going from the community, because you have the patriarchal stereotypes which are coming from each country, unfortunately, to this moment. Thank you very much.
So much, Dr. Safarov. And before coming to Amanda Womack and to Sean Norris on this issue of older women and the perspective on the pensions issue, for example, I did just want to touch on Dr. Safarov's point about violence against older women in the domestic front. Now, Emma Swart and Jenny Walton coined the phrase or the term sexually transmitted debt. And as a barrister, I dealt with many cases where, unfortunately, an older woman owned the house and she was a widow or she was a divorcee. Her son wanted to gain a guarantor for some loan that he wanted to take out, whether it was to buy a truck or something else. So what he would do is come to his mother and have her sign a guarantee that the house would therefore become the subject to the loan. So if the son defaulted on the loan, her house would be in jeopardy. And there are so many older women in this situation, which we call sexually transmitted debt, because it is debt that is transmitted to women on this basis that they are the mother. In this case, it can be transferred to the wife on the basis that she is the wife. And so many cases, fortunately, I did manage to get many older women out of this, but the women feel beholden to their son. They're not told the truth by the bank or the finance provider. They're not told that they should seek independent legal advice. They haven't got the money to do so in any event. The finance provider is eager to sign the mothers or the wives up because of the house is a valuable asset. They know that the son is not going to meet the obligations under the loan. So many cases, and I pay tribute here to Jenny Walton and Emma Swart for having come up with this term, sexually transmitted debt, which we have to recognise as an element, as a part of the violence against women that is conducted, sadly, by men in the community. But may I hand over either to Amanda Womack? Would you like to comment on the position of the older woman, perhaps in the situation of the pensions or in some other regard? And then we'll come to Sian Norris for her view on this issue as well. Thanks, Amelia.
Thank you. So then I think there are so many different points at play when we're talking about older women. I think that I feel like I've acquired the light issue that Sian had earlier. Effectively, I was speaking to a woman who was in her mid-40s a few years ago, when I was in my early 30s, and I felt like I was saying how I felt like I wasn't being heard because I was a younger woman. And she said, well, I'm only in my mid-40s and I feel like I'm not being heard because it's like I'm an older woman and I'm suddenly irrelevant. And I was like, where do you think that sweet spot is? And at the age of now nearly 37, I'm guessing that there might be a few months at some point where I might switch from being too young to be heard or too old to be heard. And I think it's really important that we look at these intersections of impacts on younger women because of things like 0-hour contracts. That means that they are having to make decisions that actively harm, well, that wouldn't be the decisions they'd make. So I've spoken to women who, because of 0-hour contracts, are unable to get the secure housing they need, or even have chosen to terminate a pregnancy that they wouldn't have wanted to terminate because they've not got maternity pay, the kind of real simple basic things that people have fought for over the years. But older women especially do have less of a voice as a result of the increasingly marginalization that we have in society. And I heard a framing as well, and I appreciate that not all older women are disabled, but I think, again, those intersections are important to highlight. Of somebody was talking about disability and they said the disabled and the not yet disabled. And I think that it was a really good framing of how we should be thinking about society, of at some point we probably all will have a disability that will impact our lives and our way of operating with our communities, but it's just not recognised properly because by the time you are experiencing that, you have less of a say. The pension injustice that we see, I think, comes along with many other injustices that older women are experiencing. There were so many promises given to the generation of women who were born in the 1950s. Health, the NHS that would support them in their time of need, social care that would be there at the time that they needed that support. And over the years, we're seeing those basic services and support for women we see it when it comes to domestic violence services and other services as well. But all of these promises that have been made for decade upon decade upon decade that have been promised to that generation have been stripped away at that last moment when women who had very little say to begin with, made up such a small percentage of parliament for the majority of their lives, has made up such a small percentage of boards and positions of power, have been experiencing pay inequality for decades upon decades upon decades. These women who have received the lowest amount of pay for women across the next generations, and then are harmed at that last point. And it's just a series of broken promises, generational promises, agreements that we have with our society. And I think the pensions issue is a small framework of that inequality. And I was really interested with Elgin's point on the education and how older women tend not to access education. And I feel that this lens of understanding the additional impacts that age has on women, whether that is technology, whether that's education, whether that's access to services in communities, is important, as I said, because it's a generation of women who have had less of a voice. And as time goes on and other intersections might come into play, that voice gets lessened and lessened as a result of essentially a society that doesn't value and support the older generation that we see in other cultures and communities around the world. Oh, and just an additional point, even things like menopause are words that haven't been used in parliaments or assemblies until the last few years. And it's just really incredible that even the work that I've done in trade unions, that I feel like a lot of women are now battling to have menopause understood as something that will impact, as I said before, the majority of people in the population, but also understand the impacts that might have in a working environment to ensure that their rights are respected as working women while they're experiencing the effects of menopause, which obviously affects women in different ways at different stages.
Thank you, Amelia Womack. And now over to Sian Norris. Sian.
Yeah, I think menopause is absolutely fundamental in terms of how we think about women's changing lives. And, you know, I think there's been some really fantastic work by MPs like Caroline Harris and celebrity campaigners like Davina McCall to really recognise and open the conversation about menopause. And opening the conversation has to be the first step. You know, it felt like it was an unsayable word for so long, and that a sort of secret that was shared between women and not spoken about. And therefore, if you were having menopausal symptoms in the workplace, it was it was a shaming thing that you couldn't deal with, and it pushed women out of workplaces, which then of course creates more of a pension gap, more of a pay gap, creates greater financial insecurity down the line. So I do think that we're seeing a real positive shift in the way we think about menopause and talk about menopause. Obviously much further to go, but I mean, it's shaming that it was seen as shameful. This is something that all women will experience, and that a good deal of women have experienced or are experiencing. So the fact that it was still seen as this kind of hidden conversation, in a way that I think perhaps talking about periods has moved on a little bit faster. You know, there was sort of a bit more open conversations about that in recent times, and we've seen with menopause. And obviously the menopause does contribute to that sense of invisibility because of how we value women in society, through reproduction and through sexuality, and seeing women as having value when they are of childbearing age, because they can do the thing that men want them to do, which is have babies. So I think, you know, talking more about menopause is going to be fundamental. I think another really important issue around women getting older is one of care. And not just access to care, but the fact that older women are sort of caught in this middle point at the moment, where many women born in the 50s are caring for older relatives and also caring for grandchildren. There's that sort of sandwich point where suddenly you're carrying responsibilities that you might have thought when you get to retirement, you were kind of moving on from that. You're suddenly in this position where you're caring on both sides of the generations. And this is goes back to all sorts of issues. Number one, the lack of funding for social care in general, the incredible cost of childcare that means more and more families are kind of turning to grandparents for help, the very gendered nature of how we think about care, where we still see it as a women's responsibility. And I think there's been some really interesting work from organisations like the Women's Budget Group on kind of how do we build a caring economy and how do we put care at the centre of our economy. And they've done some really good data crunching on, if we had a care-led economy, it would create just, I think, maybe 60,000 new jobs. I can't quite remember the exact figures, but it's worth looking at the report. And of course, one of the big things that we've seen in the coronavirus crisis is the fundamental nature of care and how we're also dependent on care. And yet women who work in care are often working on poverty wages. They make up 80% of the sector, the majority of whom are frontline. The majority of directors who are taking home millions of pounds every year are men. And yet the women who are working on the front line on £9 an hour are not getting that kind of same remuneration. And so I think we really need to rethink about how we approach care, how we value care, and why we devalue it because we associate it with women. And particularly when we have this sandwich effect of older women being stuck, between caring for the older and younger generations, we really have to start having a much bigger conversation about that. So yeah, that's what I would contribute to the older women question.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Sian. And just before we come to the next question I'd like to go to, which is climate change, I just wanted to make a quick comment on the period issue. That is, that reference to periods, menstruation, has been easier than addressing menopause. And there may be a consumer element here, because we know that we've seen advertisements about tampons, Tampax, and pads and so on. And so the advertisers and the manufacturers of these products are actually driving the issue. Of course, another element has been the question of tax, because I think at least every country in the Western world has had a struggle about removing the VAT or the CST, whatever the tax is called, from tampons and other sanitary products that are directly related to women. And that's gone on, and it seems the tax will be removed, and then it will be put back, and then it will be removed. But I think that, and quickly, I just had a thought on the abortion issue, because it is a sex discrimination issue and it should be dealt with under the Equality Act. As a matter of fact, it could be, and there's a good argument to be made. But now let's turn to the impact of COP26 on women and girls. And I'd like to ask, perhaps starting with Amelia first, would a gendered approach to climate change issues improve the current situation? And how can the United Nations conventions, such as CEDAW, that is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, how can these conventions be used to assist with the climate change agenda? And if so, of course, this would be directly relevant to our campaign for a Women's Bill of Rights. Over to you, Amelia.
There are multiple issues at play, and so the CEDAW legislation can strengthen support in a number of different ways. I think that, as I've said before, impacts of disaster means that we increase the amount of violence and instances of rape, as we saw with COVID and Hurricane Katrina, within those early days of the impact. We also know that more women live in poverty. And so it means that as a result of the impacts of the climate emergency, it's women, because of their lack of financial stability, that are also being harmed. Well, we also know that women do the majority of domestic work, whether that's collecting drinking water or even in instances of disaster, wringing out towels, cleaning places up. Even in the UK, where we saw the sewage works in Hebden Bridge hit by flooding, where there was human waste smeared on the walls of their school as a result of the flooding in that area. It was women in the community that worked and supported the cleanup operations there. So the role that we need to play is both strengthening the rights of women, in terms of ensuring that there are changes in culture and understanding against violence against women and girls when it comes to how we support people who are in those emergency situations, how we strengthen the rights of women in the workplace, and this is international, strengthen the rights of women in their communities, ensuring that we are looking at even things like, as I mentioned before, any funding and support going directly into the hands of women so that they are working on the front lines in communities, and ensuring that that finance is shared and given a socially beneficial role of how we tackle those climate issues. But also it's about representation. And at the moment, I feel that the real stories of women on the front lines simply are not being heard. And it's interesting because we see it's women, young women, who are coming forward as climate campaigners. We see it's women, Indigenous women, that are coming forward in in so many different places, even here in the UK, the work that Polly Higgins did in ensuring that we were talking about ecocide in being embedded in law. We see so many incredible women campaigning for change, yet it's all very well saying, our government saying that they will listen, but are they listening? And I think that that's my sense of what happened at COP26. A very clear statement that we needed to listen. So COP is divided into a number of different days, which is secured. It's basically the issues that they will be talking about on those days. And gender has got its own day. And it was the most incredible day, the most empowering day. It felt like the first day that I heard common sense be coming out of the plenaries, out of the different fringe events that were happening around the whole venue, because women had actually not been heard properly. There was a really clear example of a manel. So for those of you who don't know what a manel is, it's a male panel where it was 9 men on a panel talking about the economy and climate. And I know some amazing climate economists that are women. It's not hard to find them. I think that this issue is continually going unaddressed, while at the top we're hearing sympathetic words to the issue. We're seeing, yes, time carved out for women, but when Greta talks about blah, 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 what she's talking about, there are words. Yes, there are words, but where are those actions? And I think that having frameworks to hold governments accountable for their actions is going to be the most important thing that we do to stop the blah, 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 as has been said, because the actions are clear. I think the actions are understood. The social science of women and climate is understood. The science of climate change is understood. What isn't happening is the political will to bridge those gaps and make change happen.
Thanks so much, Amelia. Just on the 9 men on the panel, the economists, when Harriet Martineau conceptualized and effectively invented economics, human beings were at the center of economics. That is no more unless you actually call upon women economists, and that's why that panel was so deficient. But now let me hand over to Dr. Safarov. Elgin, would you like to comment on the climate change issue, CEDAW, and the Women's Bill of Rights? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an important question, especially when you have the, climate change and COVID-19 problems during the already close to 2 years. We have including these problems in our life, and every day it's going, problems going harder and harder, because we do not see it, but each year changing of the situation of the weather, poverty questions, health problems, we trying to dribbling, in our life, and especially women. When women have less access to the resources in the world, especially when we compare situation, especially when we take the older woman and disabled woman in this point, and climate change and what's going on in Glasgow about the COP26, we have the good discussions. Unfortunately, we had in several points politicization of this question. It's not the politics question, it's a question of the human rights, it's a question of the protection of the climate, it's a question of the coordination for our world. It's the main point what we're trying to do for the stable situation and the community decisions, the world community decisions, and the UN, United Nations, support. Of course we will support, but as you see, the main message what coming from the COP26 in Glasgow, that what kind of decisions will be including here, it will be only a result in 2050. 2040, we cannot get any results till 2030. And here are real problems. What kind of results will be in our point, especially on gender equality, women rights policy, poverty questions, and climate change. Climate change, of course, it will be a harder situation in African countries, which giving the opening road to the, to Great Britain, to Germany, to France, to all developing economic, not so good, but the better situation states. And you will see the different situations. That's why it needs to be covered, the problems, to resolving these problems about the climate change and different approach, different understanding of this problem. Unfortunately, it's reality that today we have not, equal situation for all women when we say about education rights, when we say to access to the civil services, when we say about, we have states which are having already online systems, technology systems of the services. Unfortunately, we have the states which are not including any services. It's only on the paper. It's a reality. But what to do, for example, in Great Britain, especially, what it will be giving, what kind of resources will be limited in 2040, 50, because we cannot get full access of the states, of the full states, what to do, what kind of course, it's good that Great Britain taking this opportunity and trying to be leadership in this component, but we cannot say about the climate change problems can be resolved, especially, especially intervention of these problems can be resolved only together with all states. It cannot be done only 1, 2, or 3 states. All world countries can be community taking the resolve and taking the or together the decisions. But unfortunately, we see the different approach because sometimes it's taking and politicizes this question. But another point, how to go on, how to protect our, environment, how to protect our rivers, how to protect our, everything, our forests. It's different questions. And when you see about this, when you're coming and going 30 years, 20 years ago, you see the situation different changes. You see the increasing level of the cancers, cases of the cancers. You see the increasing level another point. And these problems have direct link with each other. And it's very important that today the young generation are always, as I say, share knowledge about the young generation at this point. I fully agree that we need to involving young generation in this point, youth, but what to do for the community now, because we cannot do and change anything till 2030, because now we must do it, we must adopt our decisions much more faster as possible, because now it's not time for the thinking about how to protect, how to go on, because we're losing gender equality, we're losing human rights from abroad, we're losing all points on this question. We can say about this, we can discuss, we can open, round tables, we can make the conference. It's wonderful, but we have not the real decisions how to resolve it. We cannot find these decisions. For example, in 2020, 2019, all the same. We have all the messages, we have all the challenges, we have all the problems, but what to do? We have not, unfortunately, at this moment, we have not the, common decision of the world countries on this point, especially climate change. And when you including gender equality in this question, it's very difficult because most of the countries do not understand what kind of dependence have this and lack have such these problems together. But have full access to economic development of the state, have full intervention, have full involvement to the economic development. Social, cultural situation in the states, family situation, cultural family situation. And unfortunately, it's difficult to say about these problems. It's good that today we have such kind of message, including in our board, we have including in the question of gender equality, but the real problem are not resolving because we have not real decision. And especially when we're trying to cover this question, so the many approach, poverty questions, questions of the discrimination, when we're trying to get economic development questions, when we try to limit states production of non-safe production, points, especially. It's difficult situation, and I am not optimist about this question, because I don't know what will be with our children in the future. Because when we're thinking about our young, our age, when what we got earlier and what we got now, we can make differences. For example, I went many times, several times in United Kingdom. I can make in Geneva all the same, in Switzerland, in France. I can compare situation in all the same in our country, compare situation about the forests, about the rivers, about the climate situation and all environment about this. And I think we need to find a new resolving of this, new conventional laws need to be adopted for these international level agreements, which will be resolved, which will get full decision on this point. Unfortunately, international agreements do not regulate it fully at this moment, especially climate change and gender equality questions. Women rights protections questions are very open in this point. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Dr. Safarov. And now I'll come to Sian Norris. And then Sian, having given us her contribution on the climate change issue, will begin winding up. And I'll come back to each of the speakers for concluding remarks on ensuring that a Women's Bill of Rights can be adopted in this country for the United Kingdom, perhaps taking into account that Scotland and Wales are already on the way. But if we'll think about in those final moments of the seminar, the panel discussion, reflections on implementing, ensuring that we get a Women's Bill of Rights in order that we can implement it in the United Kingdom. So I'll now hand over to Sian. Thank you, Sian Norris, on climate change.
Thank you. So I wanted to make 3 points. The first is, I think, one of the really interesting, using that word advisedly, optics of COP is that we know that women are on the forefront of the climate crisis. We know that women are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. We know, for example, that women make up the majority of small-scale farmers in the world, and therefore are going to be on the sharp edge of things like drought and famine, which ruins crops, which ruins livestock, creates these multiple crises. And yet when we look at COP, not only is the leadership of political world so white and male, but also there was so much representation from the very industries that are causing the climate crisis. So the men in suits behind the fossil fuel industry. So this idea that we had this huge gathering to fix this problem, and yet there was so much focus, so much time, and so much attention paid to the perpetrators of the problem at the expense of the women who are going to be impacted by it, was really telling. And I think that, there's some interesting data on how much fossil fuel interest was represented at COP compared to the experiences of particularly Indigenous women and women from the global South and small scale farmers. So until we start reversing that power dynamic and thinking about who actually has interest, why are fossil fuel interests seen as dominant? Why are they so much more important than the interests of women on the ground? We're going to continue to make the same mistakes in terms of not recognizing the impact of this crisis on women. The second point I wanted to make was about the coronavirus pandemic. So one of the obviously there was no good time to have a pandemic, but it seems particularly cruel that we're having it at the time of the climate crisis too. So we know that particularly in areas of the global South, that the coronavirus crisis has had a negative impact on girls' rights in particular. This is partly because of mass school closures in order to stop the spread of the virus. But of course, when you take girls out of school, they become more vulnerable to issues like underage marriage, child sexual exploitation, and child labour. And child labour obviously cuts across both male and female children. At the same time, the climate crisis is obviously causing mass displacement. It is causing disasters that are again forcing girls out of school, which means again they are more vulnerable to these issues. So you have this real kind of pincer movement of two crises meeting each other, which both have an impact of rolling back gender equality. So again, more than ever, we need to be thinking about what is the impact of these crises on women and girls, because it's more complicated than perhaps we think, because it does involve these issues of gender-based violence. Whereas I think normally we start to think about, issues around hunger and poverty, but not going on to the next stage of what hunger and poverty means for gender equality. And the last point I wanted to make was, it sounds like the Gender Day was the best day of COP, but it's also this real problem that we have a day for gender. Like, you know, it's like, oh, okay, we'll deal with everything else on the other days. And then ladies, it's your day. Like, and I think we really need to think more about how we do gender mainstreaming. We need to make sure that women's issues and women's rights and gender equality is fundamental, like a stick, like the words in a stick of rock through every single discussion and panel and decision-making process that we have around the climate crisis. And it's there where I think something like the Women's Bill of Rights becomes completely fundamental. Because if we're saying that women have rights, that women's rights are fundamental to how we think about how we plan global geopolitical situations, then we don't have to have a special day for women. It will just be every day. It will be every decision, every platform, every parliament, every corporation, every stakeholder in these situations are discussing women and putting women and girls' rights at front of mind. So yeah, while I wish I'd been at the Gender Day, I think it's another indicator of how we need to do gender mainstreaming and make women that wording on the stick of rock in this planning. So yeah, those are my points about climate.
Thanks so much, Sian. And now it's back to Elgin, to Dr. Safarov for winding up remarks on how we get the Women's Bill of Rights here in the United Kingdom in order that we can implement it. Over to you, Dr. Safarov.
I think you must continue, activities. When I say you, I'm not using only you there, Joseph and Scott. I'm saying about the, people of the United Kingdom, citizens of the United Kingdom. It must be continuing activities for the human rights protection, especially and women rights, gender equality policy, because we have the barriers, we have the problems, we have the real situation, but you have on your hands, especially international standards, especially CEDAW committee, CEDAW convention. You can include, prepare your own, reports on the situation, alternative reports to the CEDAW committee, to the Council of Europe, Gender Equality Commission, and other points we need to be including from your side, from the community, and underline these problems. And I think that we have the court lines where it can be including the question of the pay gap, older woman population, when they had the salaries, and now they can be including circulated to the situation. But when you get the circulation, you need to including the question of the pay gap at that time in 80s, in 90s, in 70s, in 2000s. Now it needs to be including and evaluated to the new standards, especially including international standards, international labor organization standards, and gender mainstreaming policy must be continued, not only de jure, but de facto also say. De facto, when I say factually, we need to include from our sides, and we need to work on this point. We are doing from the CEDAW committee, trying to involve international standards, general recommendation, for example, of CEDAW committee, but states are trying to protect themselves so that it's not their point, it's not but we have anyway in each country, for example, we have the problem of the older woman. In each country we have the problem of the domestic ones, and it's a reality. In each country we have the question over the rape. In each country we have the problem of the killing of the woman, suicide questions, problems of the woman in alcohol and in detention, and drug users. But what about for the resolving? What kind of states need to be done for that? That's why state civil servants and the departments we are representing there, they are all the same citizens as the United Kingdom. I think for the future generation, this work needs to be continuing and taking more steps for the resolving such kind of problems. And how to continue, how to do it, the ways. It will need to be, of course, in civil line, of course, it's trying to approach it, but to get the message for the first point, for the first line, as we say every time, that it will be heard, that it needs to be listening there and taking in account, not lose anybody from behind, not let anybody from behind, and taking everybody on the board, all questions on the board, taking equal right to these questions at the same time, and trying to resolve it, not cutting this question, not spying this question at this moment. Unfortunately, in several lines, we see that we have not, from the first statement I said, we have the problem of the statistic data when you have not a direct and close service which are covering this situation. You have the service, for example, including what doing in London, in Manchester City, but full services, not online services. I try to giving it because online service is different. When you are not working face to face with the people and you're not getting the full information of the experts who are working the site, you cannot cover the situation. You cannot go on. Unfortunately, most of the states trying to make all services online and giving no direct information. That's why you have not the current and the clear map of the situation. What's happening, for example, in Manchester City or in another cities of your country. That's why when we're going on, we're trying to resolve these problems. I think the population need to go on, and human rights defenders, NGOs need to say these points as clear as possible. And go on. Unfortunately, at this moment, we have the problematic items between the NGOs, which have the direct understanding of the problems in different approaches. But when we going on the international standards, which including already, for example, Istanbul Convention on the fighting against women, sexism recommendation first time adopted in 2019, for example, in Council of Europe, or gender equality strategy adopted in 2018, 2023 in Council of Europe. What about this? How state implementing or how state, covering these points, gender equality strategy? You have the point on the older woman and social protection, this point in the gender equality strategy. But what about this? How it is implemented? Is it only giving the reports? What about the real points, real activities? And I think the main point of the taking on the board, especially experts on gender equality and women rights. When we say about the civil servants, it's some kind of delicate question. We have the delicate delimitation, and you have the experts, very good experts, strong experts in United Kingdom, which are not representing in the state, border. That's why it's difficult. Sensitive people who are knowing this item on the board, who are knowing from the heart, need to be representing of the government, need to be represented in the parliament. It's the main point, your voice. When it will be heard, when it will be listened and taking into action. If you have not such kind of people, experts, which are prepared during the years on the board of the state services and parliamentaries, it will be difficult to go on, and it will be difficult. That's why you have full access, especially as a community going to the elections, as an expert in this point. At the same time, using your approach, using your willingness, your possibility as in the civil line to go on for the human rights, for the future of the Great Britain, especially for the United Kingdom. I think we have the problematic items and we have the ways how to resolve it, but we're doing it not only for ours. I think every time we're going with the points, I'm saying that we're not doing it, we are doing for the future generation, for the future people. Because if we will go on and stand, when we say that the problem will be resolved in 5-6 years, why we are doing it, I think we have the main goal for the future generation. People also saying, who will be next generation of the older woman, also same older people which have the discriminated on the pension, on the access of the education. Why we discriminating education rights? Because it's the older people. But why we are not giving to the scholarship programs? We have not the programs for the scholarship for the older woman, especially for the including and changing the professional items. Maybe they can continue in another professions at the same time. That's why I think it needs to be done. Of course, using the civil lives, of course, going on and streaming it, not on the online, face-to-face, and trying to using you to elect, or to be representing with the people in the government, at the same time in the parliament with the people who will be representing your voice, especially. Not only, you are not going only for the older woman. I know you are working only for the human rights, especially in Great Britain, for the whole components of the human rights in this point. Because when we go to your videos in YouTube and we go to try to go on, we see and we can make the compare situation, how it's doing it. and trying to change the situation, trying to get, unfortunately, not all of the message, as we discussed earlier, going to the high level, unfortunately, but the high level is the population of the United Kingdom. The high level is the people, is citizens of the United Kingdom. It's a main point, and the United Kingdom citizens are deciding what to do. Here is the main point, how it needs to be done as a fundamental human rights system, especially in the world. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Elder. Now I'll hand over to you, Amanda Womack, for some final summing up in regard to a women's Bill of Rights for this country, and then I'll hand over to Sian. Thank you, Amelia Womack.
Thank you. So I want to bring up 3 areas that we have power. I want you to remember your own power. Sometimes it can feel like we've got this huge issue ahead of us, and it's really difficult to think about our own value in this. I often think that political change is a little bit like those 2p machines that you get in amusement arcades. You know the ones that I mean, you put the 2p in the top and it tumbles down, and you watch to see if it moves the machine. And maybe your 2 pence shifts things. And maybe you win and maybe you don't. And maybe it's the next person that comes along and has that big win. But effectively, your small action can change the entire machine and can change the opportunity for wins in the future. And I want you to think about that every time you do speak out on women's rights or tell the story of women's experiences or show the inequalities that we have in our society. But I also want you to remember this in terms of how we influence other areas in our society. When we look at signing petitions and lobbying MPs, you might think it's just a small action, but each small action does lead to change. We talk about future generations, and I would just like to show my eternal gratitude for the feminist campaigners who came before us, who came before me. That means that the rights and opportunities that I have to even be on this panel, to be in politics, to be, to be in work, have been the result of. And that, again, was because of small actions having that tumbling effect when change finally came. So yes, politics isn't just about voting for the party you want to vote for every time there's an election, which is far more frequently recently than you'd normally say. But we need to be using our other forms of democracy. As I said, that's people power, that's petitions and lobbying and demonstrating and making sure that we are using those avenues that have been given to us to influence our democracy and make change happen. But we also have institutional influence. And so those of us who are in trade unions or business groups can also be ensuring that we hold the government to account for their lack of action by moving other institutions forward faster, like we've seen in devolved parliaments. So the Working Women's Charter is nearly 50 years old, and I believe only that was created by trade unions, and I believe that only 4 of the demands have been met. But we seriously need to be analysing women's rights for the 21st century. We saw in the book Invisible Women that even women's health and safety has not been properly accounted for in trade unions and government legislation because it's not considered such a core issue. And we see, for example, women working in cleaning or even women who are working to do manicures, they're exposing themselves to a cocktail of chemicals through their work with no knowledge of how that cocktail is going to be impacting them in their health. So bringing your institutions up to the 21st century and working to move them faster than governments to use that to work to hold them to account. So the big change is government. We know that it's governments that set policies, that create the frameworks that we operate in. And once legislation changes, it means that we can work a little bit easier. But I would say that all rights, hard won, are never won forever. And we are seeing that internationally, specifically on LGBTIQA plus rights, women's rights as well. So unfortunately, we do need to keep campaigning, even if we have those wins that we want. So even if our pressure, our changing institutions and voting to change the government, I would also, or voting to influencing government to make change happen. Even if we win that, I would like to say that's the end. But unfortunately, we need to keep pushing for better to ensure that we get further, but for those future generations, but also to ensure that we are maintaining that level of change, because in instance, just because rights get rolled back all of the time, and I'm deeply concerned about how we see that on an international basis. I'd just like to say on COP, I just want to add one thing that I missed out, which is things like a universal basic income can readdress inequalities. And when we look at women of pension age, if we rolled that out first to women, WASPy women, then it would mean that women then have a choice if they want to work or if they want to live off their universal basic income, and it would readdress some of those issues. So throughout COP, I wore a face mask that said feminist climate justice. And I'd just like to leave today with saying, we do need to be working for international feminist climate justice. And I appreciate that's a lot of words bundled together, but we live in unprecedented times, and we need to be ensuring that the work that we do here in the UK, campaign for here in the UK, that we are also supporting our sisters on an international basis as well.
Thanks so much, Amelia. And now I'll hand over to Sian Norris to speak to introducing a Women's Bill of Rights as a first step, building on all those steps before. Thanks, Sian.
So yeah, as someone who's writing a book about the backlash against abortion, I can definitely confirm that some rights are not stable and that there is always a need to continue fighting for them, sadly. So I mentioned in my opening remarks how I felt after the Sarah Everard murder, there was a real sense of, as I'm using the word righteous anger or energized anger about the situation women were facing. It felt like they needed to do something. They needed to put their energy somewhere. There's a real sense of determination for change. But one of the very difficult things about feminism is we're fighting on so many fronts. Do you fight on violence against women, reproductive justice, the pay gap, migrant rights, and all of these things obviously intersect and they're all overlapping, but it can feel really, really overwhelming. And I think one thing that's very interesting about a Bill of Rights is it gives a very concrete goal where women can put their energy and women can fight for. And so I think in terms of how we get that Bill of Rights into UK legislation, maybe it's time to sort of for feminist groups, feminist individuals and campaigners and allies to move towards a specific goal and say, this is something we're after and we think can be worthy of fighting for and that can create real change, and have that sense of a common purpose to put that determination and ambition and energetic anger, so that we can really start to see women's rights doing, again, that stick of rock metaphor and running through everything that we do as a country, as a society, and as a political system. So that would be my suggestion, is how we bring the Women's Bill of Rights into the UK.
Thanks so much, Sian. And now I'm going to ask the powers that be behind the scenes to indulge me for some extra minutes, because today is the day of Violence Against Women Awareness Day. And Sian Norris, in her opening address, referred to the 120 women, at least, who we know have been killed this year. Since 2009, 16 police officers or ex-police officers have killed 16 women in the United Kingdom. Since January this year, at least 120 men have killed 120 women. 4th of January 2021, Eileen Dean, 93. 7th of January 2021, Sue Addis, 69. 11th of January 2021, Carolyn Hart, 77. 17th of January 2021, Jacqueline Price, 21. 17th of January, Mary Wells, 21. 24th of January, Tiprat Agatu, 43. 27th of January, Christy Fruin, 25. 28th of January, Suad Belhaha, 62. 29th of January, Ann Turner, 82. 29th of January, Nata Elliott Cleverly, 20. 29th of January, Rosemary Tinton, 77. 31st of January, Ranjit Gill, 43. 1st of February, Helen Joy, 54. 4th of February, Emmett Robertson, 39. 4th of February, Nicole Anderson, 24. 6th of February, Linda Maggs, 74. 6th of February, Carol Smith, 75. 7th of February, Sophie Moss, 33. 11th of February, 2021, Christine Rowe, 28. 11th of February this year, Susan Hannaby, 69. 13th of February, Michelle Linzer, 44. 15th of February, Vyacheslava Mirziawaska, 59. 16th of February, Christina Arnold, 71. 17th of February, Benilyn Burke, 25. 20th of February, Judith Redhead, 68. 22nd of February, Anna Osikova, 48. Tina Eyre, 62, in February 2021. 2nd of March, Samantha Heap, 45. 3rd of March, Sarah Everard, 33. 4th of March, Gatika Goyal, 29. 4th of March, Imogen Vahastuk, 29. 5th of March, Vanik Shu, 16. 19th of March, Karen McLean, 50. 19th of March, Stacey Nell, 30. 23rd of March, Sumita Mistry, also Sumita Saunders, 32. 23rd of March, Samantha Sammy Mills. 25th of March, Patricia Audsley, 66. 26th of March, Phyllis Nelson, 76. 27th of March, Claudia Saltiers, 30. 29th of March, Simone Ambler, 49. 1st of April, Emma MacArthur, 49. 1st of April, Sherry Milnes, 51. 4th of April, Constanto Bonilla, 50. 6th of April, Jacqueline Grant, 54. 9th of April, Loretta Herman, 85. 9th of April, Egil Begliani, 34. 10th of April, Sally Metcalf, 68. 13th of April, Sarah Keith, 26. 18th of April, Peggy Wright, 83. 23rd of April, Charmaine O'Donnell, 25. 23rd of April, Michelle Cooper, 40. 25th of April, Kerry Bradford, 57. 27th of April, Julia James, 53. 30th of April, Beth Aspey, 34. 2nd of May, Susan Booth, 62. 3rd of May, Maya Zufikwa, 26. 4th of May, Maria Rawlings, 45. 4th of May, Shanice Gregory, 29. 9th of May, Agnes Acom, 20. 10th of May, Wendy Cole, 70. 11th of May, Carolyn Crouch, 20. 12th of May, Svetlana Mikhalish, 53. 12th of May, Nicola Kirk, 45. 13th of May, a 32-year-old woman who has not been named. 25th of May, Agita Gessler, 61. 26th of May, Lauren Wilson, 34. 27th of May, Paniha Kabiba, 42. 29th of May, Jill Hickory, age unknown. 31st of May, Bethany Vincent, 26. 1st of June, Esther Brown, 67. 1st of June, Nicola Hall, 49. 1st of June, Mildred Whitmore, 84. 2nd of June, Stacey Clay, 39. 11th of June, Linda Hood, 68. 16th of June, Marlene Coleman, 53. 18th of June, Sophie Cartledge, 39. 18th of June, Gracie Spinks, 23. 19th of June, Kim Dearden, 63. 19th of June, Michelle Hibbert, 29. 22nd of June, Sally Poynton, 44. 23rd of June, Catherine Waterworth, in her 70s. 29th of June, Sikat Baldil, 73. 3rd of July, Elsie Pinder, 66. 4th of July, Catherine Stewart, 54. 4th of July, Ishrat Hamid, 52. 7th of July, Tamara Paddy, 45. Katie Catherine Branken, 37. 13th of July, 2021, Sandra Hughes, 63. 23rd of July, 2021, Beatrice Stoiker, 36. 24th of July, Patricia Holland, 83. 26th of July, Louise Kam, 71. 31st of July, Jordanos Biang, 19. 31st of July, Armand Selby, 15. 1st of August, Malgorzata Bekunska, 37. 7th of August, Megan Newborough, 23. 9th of August, Diana Nichols, 57. 12th of August, Maxine Davison, also known as Chapman, 51. 12th of August, Kate Shepherd, 66. 14th of August, Bella Nicardro, 76. 15th of August, Eileen Barrett, 50. 19th of August, Sharon Pickles, 45. 23rd of August, Helen Anderson, 41. 23rd of August, Charlotte Ford, Offerton, 35. 26th of August, Jade Ward, 27. 27th of August, Maddie Durdant Hollenby, 22. 2nd of September, Fawizah Yayed, 31. 11th of September, Ingrid Matthew, 54. 17th of September, Sabina Nessa, 28. 17th of September, an as yet unnamed woman. 19th of September, Terry Harris, 35. 19th of September, Sukit Uppal, 40. 20th of September, Nora Girolami, 70. 2nd of October, Jerikuki Jeoba, 31. 9th of October, Nicola Hurley, 37. 10th of October, Bonnie Harwood, 47. 12th of October, Katrina Trina Rainey, in her 50s. And we are awaiting further information regarding the deaths of unnamed woman, Aberdeen, unnamed woman, Doncaster, unnamed woman, Wolverhampton, Molly Taylor, Diana Mansfield, a woman found dead in Leicester, Jackie Murphy in Leicester, and beyond 120, Tracy McGrath, Liverpool, Diana Mitchell, Gloucester, a woman of 89 in Bexley Heath, Susan Denver, Emma Cooper, an unnamed woman in Nuneaton, Joanna Baird, Sarah Hussain in Bury, a woman in Southall Park, Joanna Gerrera, and an unnamed woman in Polpera. And I thank Karen Ngala Smith for this list of women dead at the hands of men. And what we must recognise on this day of Violence Against Women Awareness Day, that these women are not just names. They are real human beings who have been lost to us. And the loss is at the hands of men. And we must pay attention to the reality of women's lives and the reality of women's deaths. Marianne Evans, otherwise known as George Eliot, once said, "It's never too late to become the person you might have been." Every single one of those women and every single one of the women before them who have lost their lives at the hands of the men who have killed them have not had the chance to become the women they might have been. On this day, acknowledging and recognising violence against women, we must be aware that this has got to stop. And it is in the hands of you out there, of you men, to stop it. The men who decide that they're going to beat the women whom they once professed to love, or men who they simply come upon in the street, need to recognise you must stop. And the violence against women will only be ended when men stop being violent against women. The horror is that since that day that Sarah Everard was falsely arrested, was kidnapped, was abducted, was raped, was murdered, and her body defiled by a man who belonged to the police force, since that day, even in March, more than 81 men have killed more than 81 women in the United Kingdom. It is not trivial. It matters. And you there, you in Parliament, every single one of you, must take action and must support us in a Women's Bill of Rights so that all United Kingdom women can become and have the lives and be the women that they demand and they have the right to be. So now I'll conclude by saying it has been an extremely important day today, and I thank so much Dr. Elgin Safarov the Vice Chair of the CEDAW, the Convention Against the Discrimination of, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women Committee. Thank you, Dr. Elgin Safarov, for being with us today and for your important contribution. And thank you, Amelia Womack, Deputy Leader of the Green Party, for being with us today, and for you too making a vital contribution to this debate. And thank you, Sian Norris, Chief European and Social Affairs Reporter at Byline Times, for being here, for being with us, for contributing and to adding to the importance of this today, when we recognise and acknowledge Violence Against Women Day and all those women who have lost their lives. We sit here today advocating for a Women's Bill of Rights and in joining upon you to engage with us in this campaign so that the Women's Bill of Rights can come into the United Kingdom Parliament and become a part of our domestic law.